If you're sitting on the banks of a trout lake and notice that there are birds flying all around you, dipping and swooping at the water's surface to feed on something you can't see, you're likely in a heavy midge hatch. These aren't mosquitoes and they don't bite. If you aren't familiar with midges, at first blush it doesn't seem to make sense. How can all these birds waste so much energy trying to eat something so small? The answer lies in numbers. Midge hatches literally come in the millions. Terns and swallows can only be seen feeding as they swoop to pick insects off the water's surface. What we don't see is what they catch in their mouths midair. Simply by gliding along, birds eat midges by the bucket load. The energy expense pales to what they're consuming. And that's for airborne birds that have to expend energy to fly to feed safely. Now think about the trout in that lake. All they have to do is find a location where midges are hatching in droves. And that's literally all along the shoreline drop-offs of most of our stock trout lakes and ponds in the bottom marl in 1 to 20 feet of water. The midge season of late April through early July often sees trout specifically targeting midges in droves, and the setup is incredibly easy to do from shore on lakes and ponds that have clear shorelines. Tie on a moderately weighted size 8 leech at the bottom of a 10 to 14 foot leader under a quick release strike indicator. 2 feet above the leech, tie on a 6-inch hanging dropper of 3 or 4x tippet, then tie on a chironomid pattern in close size to the insects you see hovering around your head. In Alberta, a good starting point is a size 14 black and red ice cream cone chironomid. From there, it's a matter of casting your flies out and letting them hang under the indicator. If you can determine the depth of water out from you, try to put the leech a foot off the bottom and sit and wait. Literally do nothing except mend your line and let your flies sit. After a minute, give your line a short 1 foot pull to add a little life and see if trout respond. Trout often eat one of your flies within 10 or 15 seconds of your adding life to your stationary flies. We'll get more into chironomid tactics in future videos, but this is the best basic setup for fishing this hatch event from shore. It can be incredibly effective.
Gotta love that on a pond in Alberta.
There are many variables to success when fishing flies under an indicator. The flies used need to somewhat resemble a food source in the lake. The chosen fishing location should target where that food source or structure is present. The depth fish needs to reach the feeding zone of trout. The action given to the line, indicator, and flies need to match the trout's feeding mood as well as its prey's action. And again, the action of prey in our lakes is usually much slower than most of us are willing to fish. There are many factors we have to overcome in order to allow trout to eat our fly, and it's usually our minds that don't allow enough time. Given the above, not enough thought goes into the dynamics of a take and how we can increase our hook sets when fishing below an indicator. If we consider the fly alone, most of the time we're presenting flies less than an inch in length. Trout don't have to eat it aggressively, and they may have it in their mouths for some time before they travel 5 feet with it in their mouths. If the trout doesn't move vertically and moves slowly on a horizontal plane, that can make for a very slow, subtle bobber or indicator movement. If we're fishing in 5 feet of water with a 4-foot leader length below the indicator, that usually will be seen in the indicator dropping or moving laterally. It may be subtle, but if we have a straight taut line to the indicator, we should get a good hook set. If we're fishing 20 feet of water under an indicator, slow-moving dower or soft eats can be a real challenge. The swing distance of a 20-foot leader can allow a trout to move considerable distances with your fly in its mouth before you have a clue. This is why it's imperative to cast a firm cast in a straight line in order your leader lays out, sinks on a pendulum, and rests below the indicator. We have to pay close attention to the indicator for any pause or slight movement. The straight fly line is imperative because if we try to set a hook on a soft take with slack line arcs, the energy transfer of the hook set is simply lost in line pickup rather than setting the hook. Be sure to work on laying your line out straight. Get that leader to turn over by opening up your casting loops and really focus on delaying your rhythm until your rod fully loads on each pass of your front and back casts in order to shoot with enough energy and line speed to lay it out. Paying close attention to line control will result in far more trout landed. The hardest concept for anglers to appreciate is the speed at which trout food moves in lakes. Once understood, it vastly affects how we present our flies. We have to remember that 90% of trout food in a lake moves at the pace of a stationary leech. While trout can and will react to faster minnows, the bulk of their year is targeting extremely slow or seemingly stagnant food items. Let's have a look at a real-time situation when a shoal is firing. And that means that this is as likely as fast as the action gets on our lakes. The reality is that your casting doesn't have to be perfect on Alberta's tannin-stained waters on days with clouds in the sky and chop on the water. Simply getting your line to shoot and roll forward to lay out in a straight line to the general area on shoals suffices 95% of the time. And once it's out, your flies have to slowly sink into the feeding zone. Depending on their weight, profile, and depth below the indicator, that could take 10 to 60 seconds. We do need to be ready for a strike at all times, and trout may target the action of falling leeches. Once the indicator and flies are out, there's little for us to do except making little mends to match the drift in order to keep a straight fly line to maximize the hook set. The conditions do the work for us. A slight chop on the water gives a subtle vertical jigging motion, and natural lake and wind drift will slide your indicator and flies along the structure slowly. What we don't see is that there are likely a few trout that come to inspect your flies and refuse them. They'll remain curious and likely to continue to feed in close proximity, but may not eat. Our actions have to be subtle triggers. We can give the line and rod tip a gentle 12 to 18 inch pull in order to give our flies a little life. This pulls them up vertically and horizontally before allowing them to settle back down. It's often in the seconds immediately after this random motion that the trout that have previously dismissed our flies suddenly key into the movement and eat. On windy days or days with chop, rather than deliberately pulling our line, the mending motion to correct for wind and lake drift is plenty of motion. A good starting point is to allow your flies 10 to 30 seconds to drop to depth, then count 30 seconds before doing a short motion-inducing pull, then allowing them 10 to 20 seconds to drop back to depth, then letting them sit 30 seconds before the next motion. This way the flies are acting naturally with slow movement for 30 to 60 seconds before we give them strike-inducing movement. And this is for fishing with leeches. Many food items barely move and we simply let sit. Drifts of shoals at the right depth can be 5 to 10 minutes duration, but it's extremely effective. Let's assume that by knowing the time of year, the present insect hatches or food sources, and the most likely locations of a lake to find active fish, we've chosen to drop anchor at a likely location. The most important point in fly fishing lakes is to know the depth of the water we're fishing. When we first drop anchor, our first efforts in finding and catching active trout are usually 1 foot off the bottom, with successive flies 2 or 3 feet up the leader from our bottom fly. If we don't get takes within 10 or 15 minutes, we might try to imitate other food sources in that same depth range before we lower our indicator down the leader to raise the flies off the bottom, then either move to shallower or deeper water in hopes of finding that active zone. But before all that, we have to know the depth of the area so we can have a good idea of where to set our indicator in order to keep our fly close to the bottom. The easiest method is simply to have a fish finder or some sort of depth sounder on board. But what if you don't own one? What if your battery dies or something goes wrong with the unit? Now what? Well, there's an app for that, and it's called Ingenuity. Now, even though the depth finder says we're at 15 feet, we're going to take 14 or 15 feet, depending on your swing, and we're going to actually drop a set of hemostats on a string and just manually see how deep that is.
So if we don't have a fish finder, we can get general depth of the lake by taking some locking hemostats or locking forceps, and you clip them to the bottom fly so they're stuck. Put them over the side of the boat, and you're going to let that sink all the way until they hit the bottom. Now, okay, so it hit the bottom, and I'm going to set my indicator. I'm going to pull up about a foot and set my indicator with the peg. Now, we know the lake we're on has a gentle slope. There's not a steep drop off here, so this looks to be about 14 feet. So we know that the whole surrounding area here is about 14 feet, and that casting in any direction, we're going to be pretty certain that we're fairly close to the bottom and in the zone where the fish should be. So this is a good method to use.
If you zoom out just a little, Alberta's stock trout lakes and ponds are food factories. The vast majority are deep potholes that taper to the shore. They're heavily weeded and lined with reeds, and they simply teem with insect life. One of our great insect hatches occurs in June and July, Damsel Flies. Cousin to dragonflies, damsels are considerably smaller and thinner than dragonflies, but adult damsels fly and eat other insects just like dragonflies. They hover and zip around lake shores like mini precision helicopters. If you see them darting about, chances are very good that some great fishing can be had in and above nearby weed beds. But it isn't the adult stage of damselflies that is most important to our trout. It's the damselfly nymphs that trout target. You'll notice leftover nymphal casing attached vertically to the reeds, and a sure sign that the hatch is underway. And it's time to look at fishing the first 10 to 30 meters of our shorelines. If we watch damselfly nymphs in the water, it isn't constant motion. Nothing in nature ever is. These nymphs will hover before wiggling, pushing their fibrous tails as they move about. At the peak of the season, damsel nymphs migrate constantly to the shoreline reeds, where they climb up and hatch to their adult form. If you poke around to see them in the reeds, you'll likely hear and see aggressive feeding by fat trout that have moved in extremely shallow to feed on this migration. It's that much of a draw. While we can match the depth and speed the damsel nymphs move, it's impossible to match their wiggling and hooking of their bodies. Our fly patterns can incorporate marabou and ostrich feathers, as well as other waving materials that pulse and flow in the water. Intermediate sinking line is perfect for matching the depth and speed of traveling damselfly nymphs. Given that the nymphs tend to travel through or just above weed beds, as they mature then migrate to shoreline reeds to crawl out and hatch their adult form, an intermediate line will keep your flies in a horizontal plane, running not too deep and not floating, often perfectly skimming the tops of the weed beds. Like all fishing, we have to vary things up. Sometimes the trout are simply on, thanks to the cover of low light of cloudy days, and they feel free to be aggressive and hammer everything. A shallower fishing depth and faster retrieve often sees high catch rates, allowing trout to look up and slash upward to eat your fly. Of course, a heavy June low pressure front can just as easily turn these trout off, and slower retrieves with longer pauses need be used.
So as you can see, I've got about 10 feet to my top fly, then 3 feet further to the bottom fly. So my leader's about 13 feet long, but that gives you a good distance from the colored line to, not spook fish. I think one thing that's overlooked when you're retrieving a fly is to leave your pauses quite long much of the time. You'll often find a 10-second pause and you're just about thinking you're going to restrip, and that's when the fish is going to hit, because you're getting that good rising and falling action of your flies, and that can trigger a pretty aggressive response a lot of the time.
It's an interesting world full of opportunity, and somewhere along the line it was discovered that if you cross a brown trout with a brook trout, you get an interesting looking tiger trout, so named for its neat looking tiger-like barred modeling skin design. Tiger trout have been around for quite some time and have gained quite a reputation elsewhere in North America as a predatory trout in the right situations. In lakes with heavy reeds and high populations of minnow species, as well as depth or cool water during the peak of summer, tigers have been shown to grow well. That description is applicable to the majority of Alberta's trout lakes, so hopefully we'll see some of the larger sizes that produce stunning looking trout. Management of tiger trout is evolving in Alberta. There are a handful of lakes that they've been stocked into and may soon present opportunity to allow for multi-species lakes management, where one of the 2 or 3 trout species stocked into a lake is targeted for special management in order to grow larger sizes. We're in the early stages of developing tiger trout in Alberta, but it's a unique opportunity that may add serious value to the quality stock fisheries program at several locations around the province. Be sure to check out the Alberta government's trout stocking report each spring and fall to find a lake near you that has been stocked with tigers. By the time the aspen flush mid to late May, the first heavy midge hatches of the year are popping on the shoals of most Alberta's trout lakes. This marks what should be the first big move of trout onto shallower shoals, and many anglers hit these lakes, hoping to anchor up on prime shoals and work cruising trout. A lot of trout anglers avoid fishing lakes because locating fish isn't obvious. Unlike streams where structure causes obvious current seams likely to hold fish, fish holding structure in a lake is concealed by water depth. The good news is that shoals and lakes are as obvious as a downed tree in a river to look at and likely to hold feeding fish. Shoals are simply a raised area of a lake bed, a shallow area. This can be along the shoreline or a mid-lake hump. Shoals are part of the most productive area in a lake, the shallower littoral zone. It receives the most sunlight penetration and mixing of oxygen through wave action and allows plants in the food chain to thrive. While fish are obviously most interested in feeding on all those insects and bait fish up in the littoral zone, they need close proximity to the escape cover of depth. If you can find shoals next to depth, you'll have fish cruising and feeding along that break all year, so long as water temperatures and dissolved oxygen levels remain favorable. We set out fishing shallow on this day, 8 to 10 feet deep around a raised shoal near an island. It turned out we were too shallow. We saw adult midges in the air but simply weren't having success. We tried a variety of tactics and techniques but simply weren't getting hits. We saw no sign of moving trout. Being the first strong hatch of the season, we had to find a defined drop zone, preferably an area where there was a condensing area like a corner in the drop-off zone that would see fish cruising consistently. With cell phone reception, we looked online for the lake's bathymetric map and moved out from the island and used the depth finder to hone in on the steeper gradient depth change where we double anchored. The difference was instant and dramatic. We fished 13 feet along a depth break over a darker weed patch, and the fish were simply alive.
Awesome.
It's particularly important to note that while the fishing picked up at this prime feeding zone, we didn't speed up what we were doing. We stuck to the depth and speed of our presentation, and the fishing was consistent for several hours until the hatch period waned and the trout moved off the shoal. A spring thunderstorm rolled through, and the change in conditions saw the catching come to a screaming halt. Multi-species trout stocking is now occurring on several stock trout lakes around Alberta, providing a unique opportunity. The trout stocking is based on rainbow trout with simultaneous lower stocking rates of brook trout, brown trout, or tiger trout. The goal is to maintain an enhanced put and take stock fishery that allows moderate harvest opportunities while providing improved size ranges of trout as well as moderate to high catch rates. This management is generally possible on our medium to larger stock trout lakes. At several stock locations, anglers have been asked what type of trout fishery they prefer. Would they support a diversified stock fishery as opposed to a single species management? And what type of overall quality in terms of trout size and catch rates they prefer. Anglers are quite supportive of species diversity and larger trout, so long as some harvest opportunity remain. The total harvest regulations for multi-species lakes is lower than the traditional 5-a-day limits of our stock trout lakes, often limited to a total of 3 trout. Check your regulations carefully, as the management approach may be different at each lake. There may be a different blending of harvest options between the various species stocked in order to allow harvest opportunity and to allow larger trout to grow, providing opportunity for anglers who enjoy catching larger trout. It's a unique management system that aspires to satisfy a diversity of anglers. There are many factors that will ultimately affect whether or not these objectives are successful, and may take several years to see successes, which also may require adjustments on a lake-to-lake basis over time. Most of Alberta's low-elevation stock trout lakes have excellent weed and reed lines. These often indicate a break to shallower water, and they often have broken, random feeding lines anglers can target. Any place that edges and depths intersect are prime opportunities for trout to ambush their prey. So we're sitting here because the entire lake kind of is out that way. Bigger water, deeper water, and there's little fingers in the reeds that come and go and come and go. And we're looking for the fish. We're leaving a bit of space right here. We're double anchored fore and aft, and we're leaving space for fish to go in and cruise in the back, and we're really waiting for the minnow spray in the back for the bigger trout that are chasing the minnows to show the spray so we can cast right into them. And I'm gonna just leave my dry fly, my sedge, with a muddler minnow dropper about 1.5 feet down. And the idea is just to let it sit there and hang. We're not moving, we're not causing disturbance, we're just letting everything be natural. The birds are all around, and we're just waiting to see signs of the minnows so I can make another cast in the back. The neat thing about it is every time the wind goes down, there's some minnow spray in the back there. So there's obviously a fish or two cruising this area. And shoot, right against the cattail there. Just gonna pull it back a foot so I know that it's not hung up. And just like that. And then I'm gonna let it sink down. I'm hoping that there's a natural causeway at least 2 feet deep so that my fly is just hanging underneath my dry fly. Definite minnow spray. It's a long ways away, but you also want to stay double anchored and you want to be in position and ready. And you want to be able to shoot your fly line right into the back and keep a straight line. That way, if anybody takes, you're ready with a straight line just to lift at 10 o'clock and away you go. And just saw the bait fish splaying, and they're a little too far out, so just raised the anchor and got Nick to push forward with the electric. And that's not going to be a landed fish, is it?
Oh, yeah, he's out from under the weed now.
There we go. Anyway, saw the bait fish splaying and just said, hey, push me in, get a little closer.
It's a
heavier.
Yeah, it's fat. It's pretty good shape.
Come on, little buddy.
And it's nice when you see him. This hasn't been exactly an easy day.
No.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Come in.
All right.
Right.
Yeah, great.
There we go.
When in small alcoves along reed lines, keep your casts succinct. Here I'm simply trying to avoid the camera on the back cast, so keep your arm lower and tighter and shoot your line with fewer false casts than you see here. Shorter, more manageable casts will not only lay out straighter, but also allow you to make little reaches and aerial amends in order to hit your targets along the reed lines in 1 or 2 false casts. This is extremely important when targeting cruising feeding trout. And shorter casts always allow you to quickly respond to rises or minnow spray along the weeds, getting in tight in a timely fashion to give yourself a chance to hook that fish.
Yep, just in the reeds at Beaver Lake.
Nice Beaver Lake rainbow caught in the shallows.
One of the best aspects of fishing these reed lines is that you can take turns as friends or couples rowing each other in tight to give each other opportunity to hit the best water, staying just outside the feeding lanes and flipping into the likely water.
I got a little muddler minnow pattern right now, and I'm just stripping it quite quickly with some pauses in between. And that seems to have been working. Right to the reed bed. Let it sink for 3 to 5 seconds.